This evening, I came here to speak to you about Vietnam.
The Vietnam War. For some, a clash between capitalism and communism. For others, a struggle for survival and unification. The conflicting goals of the warring sides took the lives of between 1 and 3 million people, most of which were civilians. The turbulent history of Southeast Asia made this conflict exceptionally complicated. Thus, the French, Japanese, the Soviets, the Chinese, and of course, the Americans are all involved in this story. Why were so many world powers interested in such a distant, seemingly insignificant land with no apparent influence? And how did that small, insignificant country manage to actually beat all of them and achieve independence? Excellent questions, Igor. Thank you, Igor. Xin chào, good people. Welcome back to History and Beyond. This time from Vietnam. Today, we'll need a lot of brain power to unravel the mess that is the Vietnam War. But worry not, your favorite balding historian is here. So don't forget to subscribe, and let's go. But first, during the Vietnam War, keeping information private was a matter of life and death. Today, most of us don't even think twice before connecting to random Wi-Fi. And while the stakes today aren't exactly as high, that's how a lot of our private information, such as our passwords or photos, can get stolen by hackers. Worry not, dear viewer, because private internet access is here to save the day. It encrypts your internet traffic and hides your IP, so your data isn't out in the open for anyone to grab. As you can see, I travel a lot, and a lot of times, different content or apps can be blocked in different countries. Your internet service provider and the government can see how you spend your time on the internet. Let me tell you, I know what you're doing. You don't want that out in the open. Thanks to PIA, this is no longer an issue. Just choose another server and you'll be sent to another country. But not really, just virtually. They've got over 10,000 servers in 91 countries and a strict no logs policy that's been proven in court. They work on all your devices and support unlimited connections. And the deal is honestly amazing. Use my link piavpn.com/historyandbeyond to get 83% off, which comes out to just $2.03 every month, plus you get 4 months extra free. It's also risk-free with a 30-day money-back guarantee. And most importantly, you support my channel. Now, back to the trenches. Although the Vietnam War began in 1955, it's actually a lot more complicated than that, naturally. So we have to go another 100 years further back in the past to the French occupation of Indochina. As colonization was the trend among European superpowers at the time, Paris couldn't allow itself to lag behind London. So they were rushing to seize every remaining piece of territory on the planet not occupied by Europeans, specifically Southeast Asia. By taking over Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, the so-called French Indochina was created. The locals weren't exactly the biggest fan of their new oppressive rulers and wanted them out. What the people didn't know was that an interesting plan was underway at that very moment. Ironically, exactly in the city of Paris. A plan that might just make their dream of independence come true. After the Great War, a group of young Vietnamese intellectuals attempted to present their story to the world during the peace conference in Versailles. They were hoping that the American president, Woodrow Wilson, would support their independence. Why him specifically? Well, Mr. Wilson advocated for the self-determination of occupied peoples. And since the USA had an extremely strong influence after the Great War, the idea of the Vietnamese representatives made a lot of sense. Unfortunately, their petition was ignored. Among these Vietnamese intellectuals was a young man named Ho Chi Minh, who, due to his participation in protests against the French rule in Vietnam, had to flee the country in 1911. Ho Chi Minh was inspired by Lenin's anti-imperialist ideas and was himself a communist. After the successful Bolshevik Revolution, his goal was clear: liberate Vietnam from the French. However, as he was strengthening his influence, World War II gave him a new challenge: the Japanese. When France fell, Japan, being on the side of the Axis powers, occupied a vast part of the Far East, including almost all of Southeast Asia, and most importantly for our story, Vietnam. After 30 years of backpacking the world, Ho Chi Minh decided now was the time to return to his native Vietnam, establish the Viet Minh Liberation Movement, and secure independence for his people. And this is where things start to escalate. As the Americans were trying to force the Japanese out of the war, their goal was to weaken Japanese strongholds across East Asia. So they looked for allies among the leaders of any liberation movements in the occupied territories. And by any, I really mean any. Even the communist ones. And so, the US not only came into contact with the communist Viet Minh, but also began an intense cooperation with them. Washington provided Ho Chi Minh's forces with weapons and training, while Ho Chi Minh even praised America as an unwavering pillar of democracy. Yeah, history is filled with these juicy moments of irony. Anyway, as the US controversially accelerated the end of World War II, Ho Chi Minh seized the opportunity to declare a finally independent Vietnam. One small problem. The French still considered Vietnam as their own colony. That's cute, but I mean, the Americans would now support the interests of the Vietnamese. After all, they fought together against the Japanese, right? Well, here's the thing. First of all, Ho Chi Minh was still a communist. The only reason why this didn't bother the Americans that much until 1945 was that Ho Chi Minh followed the policy of independence first, communism second, and the then US President Franklin Roosevelt was okay with that. They had an ally. However, Roosevelt died just before Hiroshima and Nagasaki and was succeeded by Harry S. Truman, who, after seeing how communism was spreading rapidly across Eastern Europe and Asia, definitely didn't want to fight for a communist Vietnam. They were afraid that if one Asian country fell under communist influence, then the others would fall like dominoes. Because of this, Washington made a sudden U-turn and now supported the French in their fight against Ho Chi Minh. Nevertheless, Ho Chi Minh, encouraged by the Soviets and the Chinese and driven by the desire for his people's freedom, overpowered the colonizers in the north, leading to a compromise in 1954 in Geneva. Vietnam was divided at the 17th parallel into two parts. On one side, you had the communist north centered in Hanoi, supported by the USSR and China, named Democratic Republic of Vietnam. On the other side, you had the Capitalist Republic of Vietnam, with its center in Saigon, and supported by the US. Also very democratic. Meanwhile, the French just kind of off. If all this reminds you of the Korean War, it's because you're an educated person. The Japanese were kicked out from Korea in the same fashion. Then the communist and the capitalist forces fought to win the hearts of the Korean people. The country was also divided into two parts, also along a parallel. In the north, the communist state also put the word democratic in their name, and both were ruled by less than democratic gentlemen. The inhabitants of both Vietnams had 300 days to relocate from one side to the other, if they wished. About 1 million people fled from the north, unwilling to live under their regime, but also fearing political persecution by the communists. Many people were arrested and killed. Meanwhile, sympathizers of the north fled from the south for the same reasons. The Prime Minister of South Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem, had his own interpretation of the term democracy. For example, in 1955, a referendum was held to decide whether the country would remain a monarchy like it was before the French, or now become a republic. The latter was obviously in Diem's interest, since he would become the head of the state. His wish was fulfilled with a modest 99% of the votes, and with a completely legitimate turnout of 108%. The idea of the Geneva Accords was to hold a vote in 1956 to unify the two Vietnams, communist or capitalist. Diem feared due to the still significant presence of Ho Chi Minh's followers in the south, he could and very realistically would lose the elections. So he had this brilliant idea to simply just not hold the vote. And for some unknown reason, the north wasn't satisfied with his decision. And it was this very move that actually triggered the start of the Vietnam War. Communist forces were very much present in the south in the form of the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, better known as Viet Cong. By their name, you can probably figure out what their goal was. Also, they were under the direct command of North Vietnam. Now, take a look at this map. Vietnam is a long but narrow country, so the North had to supply the Viet Cong via the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was actually outside of the country, in Laos and Cambodia. This was not a conventional war, but a guerrilla war, and the North was very good at it due to the XP farmed from fighting the French and the Japanese. On the other hand, Diem was extremely corrupt and didn't take criticism very well. This caused horrific political instability in the south, as he was very brutal towards his political opponents. Also, his army proved to be unprepared, undersupplied, and incompetent. This irritated the Americans, as they were increasingly frightened by the now very real possibility that communism could actually prevail in Vietnam. So they pushed for more donations, weapons, and advisors to help the south, but nothing seemed to work. Diem was especially harsh towards Buddhists. He discriminated against them, killed protesters, and raided religious sites, which led to the infamous image of a monk who set himself on fire in protest in front of hundreds of onlookers, which I'm not allowed to show you because freedom of speech is very important to YouTube. Speaking of freedom of speech, Diem became more and more paranoid and brutal in the south. The US did not want to support such an incompetent leader. So the CIA did what the CIA does best, and informed the generals of South Vietnam that it would not react if something were to happen to the Prime Minister. Diem's life ended in 1963. In the following months, Saigon experimented with 8 different governments. The North capitalized on the political instability and, according to some estimates, effectively already controlled up to 60% of the South's territory. The then US President John F. Kennedy had refrained from involving American troops directly into the conflict. But after his assassination in 1963, Washington got a new president, Lyndon B. Johnson, who did not share the same approach to the war. August 2nd, 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin, North Vietnam. Now, there's a never-ending debate about whether the American destroyer USS Maddox was in international waters or had illegally entered North Vietnamese waters. Whatever the truth is, neither scenario helped to ease tensions. Because either way, what were they even doing here? They were scouting, or provoking, or both. Understandably, Hanoi wasn't exactly thrilled with this excursion, so a few of their patrol boats shadowed the American destroyer. And after the Americans fired a few warning shots, the Vietnamese boats attacked the USS Maddox. The attack wasn't successful, but it greatly angered both sides. Still, Ho Chi Minh didn't want a direct conflict with the US, which technically still hadn't officially entered the war. 2 days later, a similar incident was reported, so President Johnson used it as a justification for a full-scale direct entry into the war. The problem is that the reported incident actually never happened. It's believed that the American sailors misinterpreted the situation due to very poor weather conditions, but President Johnson chose to ignore this and presented the story to the American public as an attack, thereby rallying support for entering the war. Shortly after, he ordered the bombing of North Vietnam and soon received the green light from Congress to send troops to the country. By the end of 1966, there were already 200,000 American soldiers in Vietnam. At the same time, mass anti-war protests began to erupt across America. The US strategy was to conduct the war in such a way that their focus wasn't on immediately capturing as much territory as possible, but rather on killing as many Viet Cong soldiers as possible, essentially trying to wear down the enemy's forces. However, that plan wasn't very well thought out, because the Viet Cong had significant support from North Vietnam, China, and the Soviets. The North was well supplied, were extremely resourceful on their home turf. I don't think you understand just how crucial that last point was. Dense, impassable jungles were filled with traps and mines. A large number of American soldiers lost their lives before they even had a chance to fire a single shot. It was almost impossible to make progress, and whatever territory they managed to capture, they had too few soldiers to hold it. As soon as they moved away from that territory, the North Vietnamese would simply retake it. That's why American soldiers quickly lost their morale. They started clashing between themselves, and even with their officers, as hundreds of thousands deserted. Many returned home with PTSD, and at the same time, drug abuse skyrocketed. No one knew what they were fighting for, or even where the opponent was. Washington became so desperate that it even authorized the use of chemical weapons, the most notorious of which was Agent Orange, a herbicide used to destroy all vegetation, theoretically making it easier for soldiers to move through the jungle. However, the toxic effects of this herbicide are still very much present to this day. But even that failed to slow down the communists. One of the ironic advantages of a country that was then filled with nothing but farms and had little to no industry was that the Americans had no industry to bomb or destroy. This meant that the North had nothing to lose and everything to gain. China and the Soviets continued to send massive support in terms of money, as well as military advisors, specialists, and weapons. Morale in Hanoi was high. Nevertheless, Washington remained persistent, or just didn't want to face reality. President Johnson was told that the chances of victory were very low, but he couldn't bear the idea of losing, because what would that mean for the US? America is no longer number one. So he sent hundreds of thousands more troops to die in a war that already seemed lost. They built air bases, ports, hospitals, and massive ammunition storage facilities, and by 1967 there were 500,000 American soldiers in the country, and none of it was enough. So, time for plan B. Propaganda. Washington inflated the number of killed communists while downplaying their own casualties, trying to somehow maintain a sense of pride. They talked about how the war was almost over and how democracy would prevail. The truth, as we've seen, was far different. Public support in the US for continuing the war dropped below 50%, and the White House and Pentagon were surrounded by protesters. Hanoi was also growing impatient. The war had dragged on for way too long, and it was time to deliver a decisive blow that would knock the US out of the picture. This meant launching a general offensive to simultaneously attack all major cities in South Vietnam as well as military bases. The ideal time for this was the Lunar New Year, Tet, the most important holiday in Vietnamese culture. The North and the South always kinda had this deal that the ceasefire would occur during Tet. However, the war was taking too long, so Hanoi decided to attack then, because the South's guard would be down. Carrying out such a large-scale attack was still no simple task. They needed to create a diversion before the general offensive to confuse the Southerners. So they attacked an American base near the border with Laos and North Vietnam, sending loads of soldiers to make it seem as though they would concentrate all their efforts on that part of the country. South Vietnam and the US actually fell for it and sent tons of troops there. With them taking the bait, Hanoi simultaneously attacked over 100 of the South's most important cities and towns, including Saigon. This marked the bloodiest phase of the war, the so-called Tet Offensive of 1968. However, these attacks weren't perfectly coordinated, and despite being caught off guard, the South Vietnamese and Americans managed to repel the assault. This was likely because cities were not jungles, so the Americans kind of knew what they were doing there. Either way, the losses were tragic. 14,000 civilians lost their lives. The number of soldiers killed is uncertain, but it's estimated that the communist forces lost around 50,000 men. In the end, the Viet Cong were repelled, and Washington finally had a victory to boast about. This, by the way, was the first war that people could watch live on television, so the American public was soon confronted with the harsh reality of the war. They were horrified by the scenes of bloodshed, especially after the Tet Offensive. But what angered the public even more was a headline in the New York Times stating that General Westmoreland had requested an additional 206,000 troops. It was clear to everyone that this was a sign of weakness. It was clear that this war would not be won, and that soldiers were dying for nothing, for the sake of egoistic politicians who were trying to save their face because of the shame that a lost war would bring to them. This was prolonging the inevitable. Lyndon B. Johnson therefore set a limit on the total number of troops that could be in Vietnam and announced a halt on the bombings, even offering negotiations to end the war. Hanoi agreed, and on May 13, 1968, negotiations began in Paris. And nothing happened. Washington didn't stop the bombing, so Hanoi didn't stop the Tet Offensive. This led to the bloodiest few months of the entire war, after which new negotiations began in October. Now, Nixon came to power, and in hopes of winning sympathy of voters, he promised the de-escalation of war and launched a highly controversial program, vietnamization. The idea behind vietnamization was the gradual withdrawal of American troops from the war, while at the same time intensively supplying the South with weapons and preparing them to fight the communists on their own. In other words, they were slowly ditching them. But that's not even the most controversial part. Nixon actually invaded Cambodia, a neutral country, in an attempt to destroy the Ho Chi Minh Trail. One small problem with this was that the American public wasn't even informed about this decision. The public was also unaware of the massacre that the American soldiers committed against unarmed civilians in My Lai, where up to 504 civilians were killed. Thanks to the New York Times and Ron Ridenhour, these two events were exposed to the already angry American public, so even larger protests erupted. 250,000 people gathered in Washington, calling for an end to the war. Public opinion was more divided than ever. Some called for peace, while others viewed the protests as unpatriotic. In May 1970, during the protests at Kent State and Jackson State universities, the police killed a total of 6 students. Gotta love that American democracy. Still, Nixon didn't back down. Negotiations with Hanoi were leading nowhere. Oh yeah, and also, besides North Vietnam and Cambodia, the US also bombed neighboring Laos. Because why not at this point? All three countries were embroiled in their own civil wars, their own struggles between communism and capitalism. However, Washington didn't make great progress in Laos, which greatly motivated Hanoi to launch another major offensive to the south in March 1972. Initially, the offensive was successful until Nixon retaliated with his air force. So the invasion failed, though somehow both sides claimed victory. I don't know how. The whole war was just a back and forth between the two sides, and it dragged on endlessly. So many people lost their lives. Since the start of Vietnamization, over 400,000 American soldiers had been withdrawn from the war. Those who remained were so demoralized because it was clear to them that victory was impossible. They no longer had anything to fight for, yet so many people were still dying. Naturally, Hanoi was also feeling the effects of the war, and after the failed offensive, they were ready for new negotiations, which also failed. So Nixon bombed the city in December 1972, taking the lives of another 1,600 civilians in just 2 weeks. Hanoi then agreed to new negotiations, and on January 27, 1973, they signed a ceasefire. The US now had 60 days to withdraw all of its troops, dismantle all their military bases, and release all the prisoners of war. The South had the right to self-determination, and the North, but the North even had the right to keep its troops in the South. And so, after 18 years of war, after so many deaths, the borders remained unchanged. But of course, you'd be naive to think it would stay that way. By the end of March 1973, the last American soldier left Vietnam, while the North and the South were already deep in the next war after the war phase, so to speak. The US continued to financially support Saigon, but that support dwindled day by day. Without Washington's help, South Vietnam had no chance against Hanoi's attacks. The economy was non-existent. Corruption, inflation, unemployment, every statistic you can measure was just tragic. The government was falling apart. So, North Vietnam launched yet another offensive in March 1975, which they expected would last for 2 years. The offensive was over in just 2 months. On July 2nd, 1976, all of Vietnam was officially united into a single Socialist Republic of Vietnam, with Hanoi as its capital, while Saigon was symbolically renamed to Ho Chi Minh City. Although the war lasted for over 20 years, the Vietnamese people had fought for their freedom for nearly a century and a half. It's incredibly difficult to estimate how many people lost their lives fighting for their ideals. Estimates for Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and the American soldiers range between 1.4 and 3.6 million, with 80 to 90% of them being Vietnamese, while around 58,000 American soldiers died. Washington dropped over 7.5 million tons of bombs on all 3 countries, which is 3 times more than they dropped during all of World War II and the Korean War combined. This devastated the Vietnamese people. Hanoi also estimates that Agent Orange damaged the health of over 3 million people. But not just back then, it still affects today's younger generations. Children continue to be born with consequences, as it's believed over 1 million people currently have some form of disability. On the other hand, US's reputation was ruined. DC spent what would today be equivalent of $1 trillion on this endeavor, only to lose. The world's most powerful nation failed to defeat a country of farmers. Most importantly, for their long-term game, they failed to stop the spread of communism. The dominoes began to fall. Back home, the people lost trust in the government. All the lies, war crimes, scandals, and the killing of protesters left the nation deeply divided. Nixon resigned after the highly controversial Watergate scandal. It was revealed that while he was still running for president against Johnson, he had contacted South Vietnam, telling them that they would get a better peace deal with North Vietnam if they waited for him to become president. As a result, Saigon indeed broke off negotiations with Hanoi and waited for Nixon to win, only for none of his promises to be fulfilled. South Vietnam disappeared, and Nixon betrayed his own country. He prolonged the war only for his own interests, leading to the deaths of an additional 20,000 of his own soldiers and countless more Vietnamese lives. This remains one of the most controversial wars in US history, though it wouldn't be the last time the world's policemen intervened around the globe. Iraq, Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Yemen, Libya, Syria. The list goes on. So subscribe, and hopefully over the years we'll cover all of them too. See you all in the next one, good people. Pozdrav!